ladies and gentlemen, I'm Meadsy69 and welcome back to the channel. First of all, I do apologise for any sound you may hear in the background. I'm literally stuck at home, so I do have all kids around me. I've tried keeping them occupied for when I make videos. So we're back with another top 5 episode. Now this one, mainly it is pictures because there's just so many. We're going to look at the top 5 tanks with the best gun depression in the game, and we're going to start off with a couple that are 13 degrees of gun depression, and that is the tier 4 French B1. So 13 degrees of gun depression, very nice. A lot of these tanks are actually lower tier. There's not many higher tiers that have massive gun depression. Along with the B1, we have the Cromwell B, the British medium tier 6 premium tank, a lovely tank, one of my favourite tier 6 tanks, 13 degrees of gun depression, which is why this tank is a lot better, feels a lot better than the tier 6 normal Cromwell. Now, I was surprised at a couple of these entries, and I was actually surprised that some tanks didn't even make this list, like the Lupus. The Lupus I thought was one of the best in the game. However, it's not. It's 12 degrees. So I was very surprised that wasn't in it, and I was very surprised with some of the tanks that did make the list. So that is the two tanks that that's the two 13 degrees of gun depression. We're going to move up now to 14 degrees, and the first one is the Russian tier 5 Matilda 4. Now this has 14 degrees of gun depression. It is a premium tank. It's not a bad tank. I mean, the gun depression is nice on the tank, but the armor is not quite the same as that tier 4 British Matilda that's otherwise known as the armored beast, if you like, and it is an armored beast, where this doesn't quite have the armor, but it does have that nice 14 degrees of gun depression. Now, moving up the list, we have quite a few tanks that have 15 degrees of gun depression, and I was shocked at actually how many tanks have 15 degrees of gun depression. A lot of them are the British lower tiers. You have the Cruiser 4, which is the tier 3 British Tech Tree tank, 15 degrees of gun depression. Next up with the 15 degrees is the Covenanter. This used to be a Tech Tree tank. Again, it is a British tier 4. Now it is a collectible. So I was very surprised to see that this also has 15 degrees of gun depression. You can't get this tank no more unless you already had it before they changed it to the collectible tanks. Next up with 15 degrees, we have the Hargo, the tier 1 Japanese light tank. Again, I was very surprised at all these 15 degrees of gun depression tanks. They're all low. They are all low, which I like. I like the fact that all the lower tiers, most of the lower tiers, have big gun depression, because it might hopefully teach people how to use the gun depression. The gun depression for me is one of the best, most important stats in the game if you know how to use the gun depression. Tier 4 Japanese Tech Tree, the Chihi. Again, this has 15 degrees of gun depression. Moving on to the next tank with 15 degrees, it is the Dicker Max. Now, again, I wasn't surprised with this. I always knew this had a lot of gun depression, and this tank is an absolute beast when you can use that gun depression, especially after the tank got an armor buff. If you're using the max gun depression on this, you can actually get very troll bounces on that turret. So Dicker Max there at 15 degrees of gun depression. The next one with 15, again, we're moving back to the British, and it is the Cruiser 2, the tier 1 British Tech Tree tank. Now, looking at this list, most of the list in tier 1 have big gun depression, and the Cruiser 2, again, it used to be, I think this one used to be a tier 2 and it got put down to a tier 1. 15 degrees of gun depression. Next on the list, the tier 2 Cruiser 3, 15 degrees gun depression. And all these British tanks are known for the gun depression. Like, you've got the Comet, which is quite high as well. You have the higher tiers, the Centurions, the FVs, with all sort of 10 degrees of gun depression, and the lower tiers are no exception. They are all high gun depression as well. Next up, we have the new European line, the STRV M42, the Tier 5 tech tree. This also has 15 degrees of gun depression. Now, the tank itself's not got much armor, but when you have 15 degrees of gun depression, it's nice just to poke them ridges, take the shot, back up behind the ridge. Next up, 15 degrees of gun depression, it is the Emil. Just like the Dicamax, pretty much plays the same as the Dicamax. Got a lovely gun on this thing. Very, very nice gun. And if you can use these tanks, as I've just said, for their full advantage of that gun depression, where you just literally poke up that ridgeline, get the shot off, then you can hide behind the ridgeline very, very quickly, because a lot of these have no armor. Now, moving on, we have in second place 16 degrees of gun depression. It is the R35. Again, a tier 1 tank, 16 degrees of gun depression. Now, this tank used to be a monster in tier 2. It really did be a monster. When Wargaming got rid of all the lower tier tanks, they moved this down to tier 1. And when they moved it down to tier 1, I thought it was going to be completely OP with the armor that it had. That's not really the case. They obviously, because they put it down a tier, they did remove some of the armor. Now, this tank was so much fun to play when it was tier 2, when Wargaming brought out the T7 cars and the Light Vic, because they could not penetrate this tank. They didn't have Pramo, and it was literally impossible. So sometimes around those days, you would get into games where you are literally the only tank that is not a T7 car or not a Light Vic. So you would have like 13 Light Vics and you're the only one. And it was pretty much a guaranteed win unless the enemy could cap, or unless they all managed to ram you to death, which was never the case. So this is number 2, 16 degrees of gun depression, and it is a tier 1. If you can use that gun depression even in tier 1, learn how to use the gun depressions in these lower tiers, because then when you get to the higher tiers, it will pay off. Now, coming into number 1, I was very, very surprised about this. It is the tier 2 French tank, the D1. Now, this has a whopping 18 degrees of gun depression. 18 degrees. I was absolutely shocked when I was looking through the stats of all these tanks, and I see that this one was number 1. I would never, ever, ever have guessed this tank was number 1. I would have even gone far as saying that the Lupus or the Emil or anything like that, the Dicamax, was the highest gun depression tank in the game. But nope, it is a tier 2 French tank, the D1, with 18 degrees of gun depression. Now, this sadly hasn't got the best of armor, so having that gun depression, I mean, you can get bounces, you can get the troll bounces, but you really have to use that gun depression at its max. And you can see what I'm trying to do here. Like, I'm playing this tank on purpose to get footage. So I'm trying to drive up these sort of ridge lines, these rocks, just to show you about that gun depression, where you can literally have your tank facing up, all the way up, but your gun faces all the way down. I love these kind of tanks. As I've said, for me personally, gun depression is one of the most important stats in the game. So it's something I think is very important. If you have a tank with 3 degrees of gun depression, you have to expose a lot of your tank to actually get your gun up and over to be able to get the enemy. So for me, being able to do that on ridge lines where you don't have to expose a lot of your tanks is very, very important. Now, I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. I'm Meadsy69. Hopefully a lot more videos to come while I'm off work. Stay safe. I'm Meadsy. Catch you soon. Bye bye.